So yeah, it's good to be here at Wheaton. I send you greetings from our sister institution in Grantham, Pennsylvania, at Messiah. The president reminded me that I shouldn't bring up anything about soccer, but from what I understand, I guess football is the big sport here at Wheaton anyway. So again, it's good to be here. And what I wanted to do, I'm really grateful for this opportunity because when Vince asked me to talk about history at a sort of center for ethics, it really allowed me to sort of think about some of the projects that I've worked on in the past, but also some of the things that I've been thinking about for future projects. As some of you may know, I just completed a book called Was America Founded as a Christian Nation? A Historical Introduction, and I'll be talking a little bit about that book here tonight. But I'm also working on a book now on thinking Christianly about the study of history, sort of reflecting on the role of Christianity as a person of faith, as a Christian myself, and how that relates to what I do as a historian. So we're working on a little primer on that could be used in history courses at Christian colleges. So some of the things that I've been able to do with thinking about actually fit very well with the topic and the invitation. Historians aren't by nature sort of ethicists. We sort of tell the story and we let you decide whether whether it was right or wrong. So this is a great opportunity for me to sort of think about some of these things and things that are very important to me as a Christian and as a historian. So my title, as we worked it out, is The Moral Responsibility of the Historian and the Case for Christian America. And let me start off with a little vignette here. During the week of June 11, 2007, 4,000 Christians converged on Williamsburg, Virginia to celebrate the 400th anniversary of the founding of Jamestown, the first successful English colony in North America. The event was sponsored by Vision Forum Ministries, an organization that, among other things, is committed to, quote, teaching history as the providence of God, unquote. The Jamestown Quadricentennial, as it was called, a celebration of America's providential history, was a gala event. For the cost of admission, visitors were treated to lectures on various themes in early American history, historical reenactments, faith and freedom tours of Williamsburg and Yorktown, and even hot air balloon rides over the site of the Jamestown settlement. One of the highlights of the week was a children's parade, led by a Pocahontas reenactor. 1,000 boys and girls dressed in period clothing marched in a 1-mile procession to commemorate the planting of this historic colony. The week came to an end for these American Christian pilgrims with a Sunday morning worship service. The Vision Forum gathering differed markedly from the celebration planned by the national government and its Jamestown 400th Commemoration Commission. While both events featured activities for families and an array of educational opportunities, the government-sponsored commemoration did not include lectures and seminars with titles such as Jamestown's Legacy of Christ, Liberty and Common Law, or Refuting the Revisionists on America's 400th Birthday. Nor did the brochures advertising various tours of Jamestown read like the one being promoted by a popular Christian radio host and theologian. Quote, join Gary DeMar as he presents well-documented facts which will change your perspective about what it means to be a Christian in America. If you are tired of the revisionism of the politically correct crowd trying to whitewash our Christian history, you will not want to miss this tour, unquote. The Providential Historians Quadricentennial was part of an attempt, as many of you may already know, by some evangelicals to reclaim what they believe to be America's Christian heritage. They have made the relationship between religion and the creation of the American Republic a dominant topic of debate in our recent culture wars. Many well-meaning Christians, like those associated with the Vision Forum, believe that America was founded as a uniquely Christian nation. These evangelicals have used this historical claim to justify policy on a host of moral and cultural issues facing the United States today. The study of the past, they argue, has been held hostage by secularists who have rejected the notion that the American founders sought to forge a country that was Christian. Instead, they argue, these revisionists wrongly claim that the American Revolutionary era was informed by Enlightenment ideals about toleration, pluralism, and rights. In their attempt to counter these arguments, some believers in a Christian America have supported House Resolution 888, an attempt by Christian lawmakers in Congress to establish an American Religious History Week that celebrates, quote, the rich spiritual and religious history of our nation's founding, unquote. Others have taken control of the Texas State Board of Education in an attempt to change the state's social studies curriculum to better represent the Christian themes that they believe all school children should study and learn. Was America founded as a Christian nation? In my experience as a Christian and a Christian college history professor, I have found that many average churchgoers and potential Messiah College students and their parents are often confused about this topic. Unfortunately, those who dominate our public discourse tend to make matters worse. For example, during the 2008 presidential campaign, Republican candidate John McCain announced that, quote, the Constitution established the United States of America as a Christian nation, unquote. But the Constitution actually says nothing about the relationship between Christianity and the United States. Similarly, former Arkansas governor and McCain's fellow presidential candidate, Mike Huckabee, said on the campaign trail that most of the 56 men who signed the Declaration of Independence were clergymen. In fact, only one member of the clergy signed the Declaration of Independence, College of New Jersey President John Witherspoon. Recently, television personality Glenn Beck has devoted his Friday afternoon shows to the religious beliefs of the founders. We live in a soundbite culture that makes it difficult to have any sustained dialogue on these historical issues. It is easy for those who argue that America is a Christian nation, and I might add for those who do not, to appear on radio or television programs, quote from one of the founders or one of the nation's founding documents, and sway people to their positions. These kinds of arguments, which can often be quite contentious, do nothing to help us unravel a very complicated historical puzzle about the relationship between Christianity and the American founding. It is not just the secularists and the Christians who disagree on these issues. Evangelicals have legitimate differences over these issues as well. In 2005, when Time magazine announced the 25 most influential evangelicals in America, the list included both David Barton and Mark Knoll. Barton, the founder of an organization called Wall Builders, is one of the country's foremost proponents of the theory that America is a Christian nation. Knoll, who of course needs no introduction here at Wheaton, has spent a good portion of his career attempting to debunk, both directly and indirectly, the notion that America is a Christian nation. Barton has suggested that Knoll and scholars like him rely too much on the work of other historians and not enough on primary documents. Knoll has offered careful and nuanced arguments to refute the Christian nationalists, but as a scholar, his work lacks the immense popularity among ordinary evangelicals that Barton enjoys. When I speak on this subject, and I do a lot of speaking we have this thing in Pennsylvania called Pennsylvania Commonwealth Speakers, in which I travel around the state of Pennsylvania speaking to libraries and social civic groups and so forth on this. Usually when I speak on this subject, and usually the title is something like, Was America Founded as a Christian Nation? So it's sort of provocative and people will show up. I've found that most people come to my lecture with their minds already made up, basically looking for me to provide historical evidence to confirm their position. So what is a historian to do? If there is one thing that historians should not do, I would argue, it is to jump into the political debate. In some ways, the question in the title of my current book, Was America Founded as a Christian Nation?, is a bad historical question. This was a debate between my publisher and me, saying I don't want the book to be titled that way, and the publisher, of course, well, we'll sell more books if you give this sort of provocative title. It's a question that does not conform to easy yes and no answers that most who ask the question are looking for. My goal in this lecture is not to lay out a case for or against a Christian founding. I hope you will buy my book, there's my pitch, my only pitch, to see how I handle the details, such as the way Americans have always understood themselves to be part of a Christian nation, whether or not they're interpreting the founders correctly or not. I argue that Christians in America have always, Americans generally, all the way up until the sort of 1950s, have always understood themselves to be part of a Christian nation. Or you can find stuff about the relationship of evangelicalism to the coming of the Revolution, the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, the state governments, or the religious beliefs of the founders, which I cover in detail. But my intention tonight is to reflect on the responsibility of the historian, using the Christian America controversy, and a few others, as a case study. At the heart of the debate over whether the United States was founded as a Christian nation is the relationship between history and American life. It is thus important to think about the nature of the discipline of history and identify the difference between good history and bad history. What is the purpose of studying history? What do historians do? Does everyone who conducts a serious study of the past qualify as a historian? In my opinion, writes Pulitzer Prize-winning historian Gordon Wood, not everyone who writes about the past is a historian. Sociologists, anthropologists, political scientists, and economists frequently work in the past without really thinking historically. What does Wood mean by this? Is there a difference between the past and history? Two terms we often assume are synonymous. It is also important to remember just what we do when we say that we are historians. John Tosh, a historiographer, writes, "All the resources of scholarship and all the historian's powers of imagination must be harnessed to the task of bringing the past back to life, or resurrecting it. Historians make the dead live. They bring the past to an audience in the present. If we think about the vocation of the historian this way, then perhaps we may distinguish between history and the past. The past is the past, a record of events that occurred in bygone eras. But history is a discipline, the art of reconstructing the past. Most human beings tend to be rather present-minded when it comes to confronting the past. The discipline of history was never meant to function as a means of getting one's political point across or convincing people to join a cause, as it is often used by Christian nationalists and their opponents. Yet Americans, both on the left and the right, use the past for these purposes all the time. Such an approach to the past can easily degenerate into a form of propaganda, or as the historian Bernard Bailyn described it, indoctrination by historical example. When we engage in the careful reconstruction of the past, we will find that it is often strange when compared to our present-day sensibilities. There were some people in the past that burned witches. Others engaged in human sacrifice. As historian David Lowenthal, echoing the late L.P. Hartley, reminds us, the past is a foreign country. They do things differently there. It is the strangeness of the past that turns many off to its study. What if the past does not inspire me? What if we are required to investigate an era or a movement that at first glance does not seem to teach us anything about ourselves or our society? How does knowledge of the medieval feudal system help us live better lives? Will our lives be enriched by a thorough knowledge of the causes of World War I? Perhaps. But it is easy to ignore or miss the parts of the past that we do not like. Yet all historians must come to grips with its utter strangeness. Present-mindedness makes for bad history. As noted historian of the American West Richard White writes, any good history begins in strangeness. The past should not be comfortable. The past should not be a familiar echo of the present, for if it is familiar, why revisit it? The past should be so strange that you wonder how you and people you know and love could come from such a time. Or for you Europeanists out there, listen to the words of Carlo Ginzburg. The historian's task is just the opposite of what most of us were taught to believe. He must destroy our sense of proximity to the people of the past because they come from societies very different from our own. The more we discover about these people's mental universes, the more we should be shocked by the cultural distance that separates us from them. Gordon Wood has said if someone wants to use the study of the past to change the world, he or she should forego a career as a historian and run for office. While it is certainly a worthwhile exercise to use the past to critique a particular dimension of contemporary society, I would argue that historians by vocation
are not primarily cultural critics, nor are they in the business of using the past to promote a particular political or cultural agenda. The task of the historian is to pursue truth, wherever it may lead. He or she works with original or primary documents to reconstruct the past in all its complexity and fullness. While the historian might choose the subject she will study based upon current events or personal interest, and I'd be lying to say I picked the subject of my book, that it wasn't driven by personal interest or current events, the historian must always let the evidence speak, even if that evidence leads her toward a conclusion that may not be useful. Wood notes, the present should not be the criterion for what we find in the past. Now let's move on to an overview of how Christians study the past, or have studied the past. Over the years, Christians have proposed several ways of thinking about the relationship between their faith and the study of history. Some Christians may study the past as a means of explaining the providence of God. For these students of the past, the purpose of history is to discern the will of God through the ages. In this view, history becomes theology. Its purpose is to communicate God's designs, not unlike some of the historians of colonial New England, who wrote history for the purpose of glorifying God and revealing his handiwork. For example, early histories of America, such as William Bradford's Of Plymouth Plantation, written around 1650, or Cotton Mather's Magnale Christi Americana, 1702, were written to explain God's providential ordering of the past. These older works were designed to bring glory to the Creator for bestowing his blessings on America, and particularly New England. Bradford and Mather wrote with a sense of certainty about God's superintending hand. They believed that it was possible to understand God's will and trace it over time. This manner of doing history was common in America until the late 19th century and still has its adherents today. Historians, however, even Christian historians, should be cautious about using providence as a means of explaining historical events. The will of God in the past often remains a mystery. As theologian Charles Matthews, writing about St. Augustine's view of providence, notes, the lesson of providence is not that history can be finally solved, like a cryptogram, but that it must be endured, inhabited as a mystery, which we cannot fully understand from the inside, but which we cannot escape of our own powers. The primary task of the historian is to describe the way that human beings, created by God in his image, have endured and inhabited the mysteries of life. History is more about the study of human beings than it is about the study of God. As the noted historiographer R.G. Collingwood put it, the work of providence in history is recognized, but recognized in such a way which leaves nothing for man to do. One result of this is that historians fell into the error of thinking that they could forecast the future. Another result is that in their anxiety to detect the general plan of history, and their belief that this plan was God's and not man's, they tended to look for the essence of history outside of history itself, by looking away from man's actions in order to detect the plan of God, and consequently the actual detail of human actions became for them relatively unimportant, and they neglected the prime duty of the historian, a willingness to bestow infinite pains on discovering what actually happened. God's plan for the ages is not something that historians, or anyone else for that matter, can decipher with any degree of certainty. As Christians, we believe that God has spoken the world into creation, but his creation is ongoing. As a result, we must be patient and wait in expectant hope for its full meaning. Hope reveals our faithful knowledge's temporal dimension. It infuses our knowing with the sort of not yet, with the resistance to the delusion that we know anything completely, even the most mundane things. This is true because we are sinners, of course, but it is also true because nothing yet bears the full weight of its eschatological glory. As 1 Corinthians 13:12 reminds us, for now we see in a mirror dimly, but then face to face, now in part, but then I shall know fully, just as I have always been fully known, or just as I also have been fully known. Christian historians would do better to approach their task with a sense of God's transcendent mystery, a healthy dose of humility, and a hope that one day soon, but not now, we will all understand the Almighty's plans for the nations. When we arrive at the judgment of God, Augustine wrote, the time of which in a special sense is called the day of judgment, it will then become apparent that God's judgments are entirely just. Now, not all Christian historians think that providence is the best way of interpreting the past. Some believe that the past must be critiqued from the perspective of Christian orthodoxy, a body of biblical teaching and church tradition that has always guided Christians in judging right from wrong. This approach to history offers ethical judgments on characters from the past, the ideas they defended, and the movements to which they affiliated. Indeed, the past provides us with moral lessons, making the historian, sometimes overtly, but most times subtly, although no less powerfully, a critic by nature. Historian Robert Gleason has argued that historians have a threefold task: to explain what happened, to ask why it happened, and to ask if what happened was good. Those who embrace this vision of history find it imperative to add an additional moral dimension to their study of the past, one that is informed by their Christian convictions. The validity of Gleason's approach depends a lot on how the place of moral criticism is employed. There is, after all, a difference between a historian and a moral philosopher. Gleason's first two steps are certainly well within the role of the historian, but to ask if what happened in the past was good leads to a blurring of the disciplinary boundaries between history and ethics, and if we are not careful, can replace sound historical thinking with moral criticism. Allow me to illustrate this point from a typical United States history survey course at Messiah College. At an appropriate point in the semester, I give students copies of documents written by 19th century Southerners, theologians and ministers mostly, who defended the institution of slavery. These writings are completely foreign to my students. Many of them are appalled by the way that these Southerners used the Bible to justify their peculiar institution. They want to immediately critique the arguments of these men from the perspective of their own moral and ethical commitments. Many of them will offer insights from their Bible or theology classes as arguments for why these slaveholders misunderstood the teachings of Scripture, despite the fact that the New Testament never directly condemns slavery. Thinking about the ethical dimensions of 19th century slaveholding can be an intellectually stimulating and a morally helpful exercise. But it should not be the primary focus of a history classroom. Historians are primarily after understanding. They must avoid what historian Jim LeGrand and my colleague at Messiah has described as preaching through history. Before condemning these pro-slavery advocates, history students need to know why someone from the 19th century would see the need to make such a defense of slavery. What was the context in which these documents were written? Who is the intended audience? What are the main issues at stake in the author's arguments? It is important that students enter into the world of a slaveholder and make an effort to empathize with them, no matter how repulsed they are by his words. In the end, engaging the past in this way could eventually result in a much more nuanced and rich critique of pro-slavery views. Finally, Christians have approached the study of the past through the doctrine of creation and the belief in the incarnation of Jesus Christ. A belief in a God who creates implies that there is inherent value in studying the works of his creation, including the history of interactions among human beings who have inhabited the created world through time. An incarnational approach to history affirms that God revealed himself most completely in the material world, John 1. It suggests that the material world is important because it is the locus in which the Word became flesh. The stuff of earth thus merits scholarly and intellectual consideration in all its realms. Belief in Christ and his redemptive work on our behalf requires obedience and submission to God's commands in every aspect of our lives. To confess the gospel naturally results in the acknowledgement of God's sovereignty over all creation and all fields of inquiry. Now, it is hard to argue with this Christian approach to thinking about history. The incarnation is the theological idea that must drive every Christian's understanding of the past. It offers a Christian reason for paying attention to all the past, whether it is relevant or not. But while such a method offers a much-needed philosophical and theological justification or starting point for why the study of the past is important, it does not offer much in terms of how Christian faith might apply to the actual doing of history. What does such an incarnational approach to the study of the past look like, for example, in a middle school classroom? Should Christians acknowledge or simply assume their Christian presuppositions about the past, and once acknowledged or assumed, go ahead and study the past just like everyone else? Creation and the incarnation are theological starting points that all Christians should affirm, but they do not help us very much in actual practice. Now, I want to offer Christians a slightly different approach to thinking about the past. It is an approach that avoids the danger of present-mindedness, the certainty of providentialism, and the temptation to trade history for moral criticism. While it is grounded in the idea that all of the past is important because it is the ongoing work of God's creation, it offers a more practical benefit for Christians in studying the past, and at the same time intersects with some of the best and most recent scholarship in historical thinking. My argument is this: the study of history can help us mature spiritually. Now, what do I mean by that? Scholars of historical thinking, and I'm particularly thinking here about Sam Weinberg and his masterful Historical Thinking and Other Unnatural Acts. Get this book if you're a history major. Read this book. It is a phenomenal introduction to historical thinking. Weinberg has argued convincingly that it is the very strangeness of the past that has the best potential to change our lives in positive ways. Those who are willing to acknowledge the past as a foreign country, a place where they do things differently than we do in the present, set off on a journey of personal transformation. Weinberg writes, "It is this past, one that initially leaves us befuddled, or worse, just plain bored, that we need most if we are to achieve the understanding that each of us is more than the handful of labels described to us at birth. An encounter with the past in all its fullness, void as much as possible of present-minded agendas, can cultivate virtue in our lives. Such an encounter teaches us empathy, humility, selflessness, and hospitality. By studying history, we learn to listen to voices that differ from our own. We lay aside our moral condemnation about a person, idea, or event from the past in order to understand it. This is the essence of intellectual hospitality. The act of interpreting a primary source with students becomes the equivalent of inviting a person from the past into our classrooms. And this applies to a college professor, a high school teacher, anyone who teaches the past, even someone working at a historical society or a museum educator. By taking the time to listen to people from a foreign country, we rid ourselves of the selfish quest to make the past serve our needs. The study of the past reminds us that we are not autonomous individuals, but part of a human story that is larger than ourselves. Weinberg sums it up well in probably one of my favorite quotes about the way in which historians do their work. Weinberg writes, "For the narcissist sees the world, both past and present, in his own image. Mature historical understanding teaches us to do the opposite, to go beyond the fleeting moment in human history into which we have been born, to go beyond our brief life, to go beyond our own image. History educates, literally to lead outward in the Latin, in the deepest sense. Of the subjects in the secular curriculum, it is the best at teaching those virtues once reserved for theology: humility in the face of our limited ability to know, and awe in the face of the expanse of history." Are we willing to allow history to educate us, to lead us outward? Weinberg's reference to theology is worth further exploration. Again, in his book, The Theology of Public Life, Charles Matthews, a theologian at the University of Virginia, argues that Christians today are afflicted by the sin of escapism, the desire to flee from God and each other. God wants us to turn toward Him, but He also wants us to turn toward each other. In the process of loving our neighbor, for Matthews, such a practice, by the way, goes to the heart of civic life, we grow as Christians. Through the virtues cultivation through engagement with public life, Matthews writes, the souls of Christians may be purified in and through their public engagements. Now, what if we viewed the study of the past as a form of public engagement? Even if the person we engage is dead, we can still enter into a conversation with the sources that he or she has left behind. In a passage strikingly familiar to Weinberg's thoughts on the discipline of history, Matthews argues that when we encounter people in all their strangeness, we, quote, find ourselves decentered. We find that we are no longer the main object of our purposes, but participate in something not primarily our own. It's almost as if Weinberg read Matthews or vice versa here. This confession, then, is itself a turning to the other, not in the interests of mutual narcissism, which makes the other only a consolation prize for having to be already ourselves, but as an openness to transforming and being transformed by the other. If we take the Imago Dei seriously, the notion that all human beings are created in the image of God, then we should also take seriously the idea that those who lived in the past were also created in God's image. The very act of studying humanity, past or present, can be what Matthews calls, quote, an exploration into God, a mode inquiring God, an encounter, unquote. An encounter with the past thus becomes an act, I would argue, of spiritual devotion. This kind of encounter, quote from Matthews again, provides more than enough opportunities for humility and penance, recognition of one's sin and the sins of others, and a deepening appreciation of the terrible awfulness of God's providential governing of the world. Indeed, involvement in public life today may itself increasingly need some such ascetical discipline. In other words, and that's unquote, in other words, history is not only a discipline in the sense that philosophy or literary criticism or sociology are disciplines. It is also a discipline in the sense that it requires patterns of behavior, such as the denial of the self, that are necessary in order to meet the other in a hospitable way. Doing history is not unlike the kind of disciplines we employ in our spiritual lives, disciplines that take the focus off of us and put it on God or others. If this is true, then prayer, a reliance on the Holy Spirit's power, and other spiritual practices should provide help in the pursuit of the kind of self-denial, hospitality, charity, and humility needed to engage the past in this way and allow ourselves to be open to the possibility of it transforming us. How often do we pray over our scholarly or academic historical work? And I don't mean prayer for help in getting the paper done on time, or a prayer that we keep our sanity amid the heavy workload. I mean a prayer that the Lord would use our encounter with the past to transform us, to help us live what theologian Scott McKnight calls the Jesus Creed, loving God and loving others. Like any type of public engagement, an encounter with the strangeness of the past inevitably leads to contemplation of the mysteries of providence, the sovereignty of God, and the cultivation of that holy terror that is integral to true piety. It forces us to love others, even a 19th century slaveholder, when they at first glance seem to be unlovable. Failure to respect the people in the past is ultimately a failure of love. It is a failure to recognize the common bond that we share with humanity. It is a failure to welcome the stranger. Moreover, when we uncover sinful behavior in the past, it should cause us to examine our own imperfect and flawed lives. This kind of engagement, as Matthews puts it, quote, brings us repeatedly against the stubborn, bare there-ness of the people we meet in public life. It teaches us again and again the terrible lesson that there are other people, other ideals, other points of view that we can see and appreciate, even if we cannot inhabit them and remain ourselves. The discipline of history requires us to apply James 1:19 to our lives. We must be quick to hear, slow to speak, and slow to become angry. This does not mean that we have to agree with every idea we encounter in the past. Sometimes we cannot, to use Matthew's words, inhabit an idea and still remain ourselves. But education, to be led outward, does require a degree of risk. Without taking a risk, without being open to transformation, liberal education cannot happen. Self-denial, writes historian Mark Twain, is a willingness to surrender ourselves for the sake of a better opinion. Wisdom is the discernment of when it is reasonable to do so. A Christian who studies the past must be prudent. She must be slow to speak and quick to listen to the people she meets in the past. And she must pray for wisdom. In order to illustrate what this might look like in a classroom, again, I will return to the example about teaching texts written by 19th century pro-slavery intellectuals. Just like everyone else in my class, Kevin was appalled at the arguments contained in these documents. But by entering into a conversation with their authors and being open to letting these writers change him, he became a better Christian. Kevin learned that plantation owners often argued that slavery was justified because slaveholders treated their labor force, slaves, better than the burgeoning capitalists of the North treated their immigrant laboring classes. Slaves were clothed, fed, Christianized, and usually worked 10 hours a day. Northern industrial laborers, living in an age before the usual benefits afforded to workers today, worked 16-hour days, were paid so poorly that they could not feed themselves or their families, and generally lived lives that were much worse than those of Southern slaves. How dare the Northern abolitionists and capitalists claim the moral high ground? How dare they accuse slaveholders of immorality while all the while turning a blind eye to the plight of the working class slaves in their midst? The South's anti-capitalist feudalism offered, as historians Elizabeth Fox Genovese and Eugene Genovese have shown, one of the most powerful critiques of industrialization in 19th century America. Kevin was convinced that the slaveholders' criticism of Northern industry did not take them off the moral hook. Slavery was still a reprehensible and sinful practice. Nor was Kevin sure that this defense of slavery was valid. The Northern workers may have had it rough, perhaps even rougher than the slaves, but what? At least they were free. Kevin did, however, learn to be cautious about condemning others before hearing their side of the story. His response to these writers was not a knee-jerk moral criticism, but a thoughtful engagement with historical texts that taught him a valuable lesson about removing the log from your own eye before taking the speck out of the eye of another. Kevin listened to the slaveholders. He understood them. He empathized with them. He saw them as fellow human beings. He realized that some of their flaws were also present in his own life and his relationships with others. And in the process, he was in a small way changed. Are not these the kinds of transformative encounters that we as Christians all want to experience? It seems likely that dozens and dozens of such encounters would not only produce a liberally educated person, but a person of Christian character as well. I wish I could say that Kevin is representative of the way most students approach historical texts, and I think the historians in the room might agree with me. It is not. Indeed, we have much work to do. But his case reveals that real transformation is possible when we are exposed to opinions that we naturally find uncomfortable. Students of the past do not have to agree with slaveholders to learn something from them, even if it only reminds them that we, like the authors of these texts, are flawed, imperfect creatures in need of redemption. This is what history can do, and this is why Christians must study it. We need to practice history not because it can win us political points in the culture wars or help us push our social and cultural agendas forward, but because it has the amazing potential to transform our lives. Unfortunately, those Christians who believe that the United States was founded as a Christian nation have no particular interest in pursuing the discipline of history. Moreover, popular historians on the left, and I'll name names here, I mentioned David Barton, I'll name people like Howard Zinn, for example, fall victim to the same historical sins. So I ask again, what is a historian to do? Now, I'm working on an answer to this question as part of my next project, but in the meantime, I think we need to get out of the ivory tower and be in the business of teaching the public how to think historically. Historians, as historians, need to bring the benefits of this kind of historical thinking to churches, civic organizations, community centers, and schools. Perhaps we should actively seek to share our wisdom and insight at the local Rotary Club meeting, or in a Sunday school class, or in our daughter's 4th grade classroom. Perhaps these kinds of engagements, or perhaps a well-placed op-ed or an article in our denominational magazine, should count towards tenure and promotion at places like Wheaton or Messiah. Moreover, we need to train students that a career in the ivory tower may not be the young historian's highest calling. Perhaps a history major might have a greater impact working at a local historical society, teaching students, or bringing the virtues of historical thinking to the places where they choose to live, work, and have their being, even if they do not find employment in a history-related field. If done well, the study of history might just help contribute to a ceasefire in our so-called culture wars. While history will never replace the transforming power of the gospel to change lives and influence our culture, it has the potential to contribute to a moral society rooted in civility and to bring an end to the shouting matches, whether it is the debate over Christian America or any hot-button issue
that faces our society today. Thank you. We have time for questions? Questions, comments, tomatoes, whatever. Yeah.
Well, yeah, I'm familiar with Howard Zinn. You mentioned him. The only work I know by him that's really popular is Nation's History.
The People's History of the United States.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is that what you had in mind?
Well, I think you know, I'll be blunt here. I think Howard Zinn's A People's History of the United States is another example of what Balin calls indoctrination by historical example. You can believe politically in Zinn's positions, but I don't think it's good history. I mean, the best review I've actually read of Howard Zinn's People's History comes from a historian, a sort of left-wing historian of populism who teaches at Georgetown named Michael Kazin, who wrote a scathing, I mean, this is a person, I think he's the editor of Dissent magazine, and this is a person who is, you know, clearly on the left and probably shares most of Zinn's politics. And if you want to email me, I'll send you the link. I think you can still find it online. But he you know, tears into this book saying it's not, I mean, it's a pretty contentious, pretty, you know, maybe even nasty review, saying, you know, what Zinn's doing is actually hurting the left and hurting the sort of, you know, the sort of intellectual strength of the left, the intellectual, you know, the robust nature of the left's argument, because he's pretty much just using the past to sort of promote some kind of agenda without looking at it in sort of all its, you know, its complexity and fullness. So I would say people like Howard Zinn are sort of a mirror. Now again, Zinn is not completely invested in this Christian America thing. Well, actually, he's not alive anymore, but you know, he's a mirror image of, I think, what David Barton and others on the right are doing. You know, it's clearly history to promote something in the present, and, you know, call it cherry picking, you know, call it whatever you want, but it's really one side of the story. Nevertheless, it's a great book. It's a great read. You know, I've actually enjoyed reading it. I think I've read it multiple times, but I'm not sure it's the best. You know, I'm not sure I would call it good history. Yeah. Yeah.
Mark Knoll was once asked if he believed in providential history, and he said that he hadn't seen it done well.
Yeah, I've seen that quote too.
But he believed it could be done.
Yeah.
And so I was just wondering, what do you think of that quote, and what are your thoughts on doing providential history?
I wish Mark went on that quote and said, you know, I haven't seen it done, but this is what it would look like. I'm not convinced at all that providence is helpful whatsoever to the historian's vocation. Now, you know, in some sectors that may mean I'm a bad Christian, I guess, right? But it's just not, you know, it's just not a useful category for sort of historical analysis. I mean, you know, the providential historians, the way it's often used, you know, by people on the Christian nationalists on the right, for example, you know, God intervened here, you know, the fog came up in August 1776 and the Continental Army made it across and escaped, you know. I tend to, you know, I grew up Catholic, so maybe I have this sense of appealing to mystery, you know, that's my sort of default position rather than certainty. You know, I would say if you believe God is sovereign, right, over all human history, you know, to suggest, well, God intervened here on October 31st, 1517, you know, in the Protestant Reformation, you know, it implies that God is interjecting here, but, you know, he hasn't been sovereign all through the other periods of time. You know, this is where he inserted himself for the cause of Protestantism or the cause of America or, you know, something to that effect. So, you know, we use providence in our own spiritual lives all the time. You know, we look back on our lives and we often say, you know, I see the Lord led me there. I see the Lord took me down this path. And I'm wrestling with that myself, you know, because I do that too. I see, well, the Lord directed me to this college. I came to Wheaton and it changed everything, you know. Yeah, one of the things I'm thinking about in this new project, it's tentatively called, it's coming out hopefully in 2012 with Brazos, called The Power to Transform, A Christian Reflection on the Past. It's a working title. I haven't written a chapter on providence yet, and so I'll plead ignorance at this point, but I really want to know what that might look like. Someday maybe I'll ask Mark what he means by that, but yeah.
Your thesis seemed to be that we could approach history seeking or hoping for transformation.
Yeah.
How
Well, I think the difference is, when you're using the past to look for moral lessons, especially when it comes to individuals, right? I want to model myself after, Jonathan Edwards is my hero, kind of thing. And I want to be like Jonathan Edwards and use him as a model and an example. I think what I'm trying to suggest is that the transformation, and I'm debating this term too, because I'm actually, my approach is sort of moving away from the more sort of epistemological discussions of this, right? Can there be Christian history? These kinds of things, which really dominated a generation of historians before me. I'm much more interested in, how, everybody who writes about Christian history seem to be American religious historians. There's not many of us out there who are actually reflecting on this question that don't study American religious history, right? And that's where I'm coming from. I'm an early American historian by training. Now, I dabble in religion. Obviously, this book is all about religion, but I teach in a history department. I teach U.S. survey courses and Civil War and colonial America and these kinds of things. I teach about economic life. I teach about markets. I teach about, these kinds of things. How does then approaching something that seems completely irrelevant or maybe doesn't serve the church in some way, how can my students engage in a sort of world of, get to know a medieval peasant from whatever shards of evidence are left behind. And in the process, through that public encounter, one is transformed. You don't have to necessarily say, I like this guy, or, I want to learn a moral lesson from him. I'm not saying the past can't teach us moral lessons, but that's not the sort of crux of the argument I think that I'm making here. I think just an encounter with the past, again, a lot of this has to do with, it needs to be done in the sort of hands of a teacher who understands that, history is not just about the facts. It certainly is, but there's also these historical thinking skills that come. Historians really offer a different way of looking at the world than most people that can be transformative. And again, other disciplines offer different ways of thinking, about the world. So I'm somewhat of a disciplinary guy, I guess, I'm someone saying, here's the discipline of history. Here's how historians work. And what can that do, to bring spiritual growth even in our lives? How can we worship God or love neighbor through the discipline? Rather than, usually, at Christian colleges, it's, well, we really get our spiritual growth in the humanities, from the integration of various disciplines or through some common core curriculum or, and I'm not saying that, other disciplines can't produce the same thing, but how does the discipline of history itself provide some kind of spiritual sustenance or moral reflection, moral growth, or, yeah. Yeah, Tracy.
John, thank you for just a wonderful talk. Thanks. I'd like to take us back to the Vision Forum.
Yeah,
that you used to bookend or frame your talk.
There's a lot of that in the book about those kind of events.
Well,
yeah.
so this, probably something you thought a great deal about, I suspect. How is it possible, if it is possible, for individuals like yourself or other Christian scholars to enter into a constructive conversation?
In some ways, when I respond to a question like that, Tracy, sometimes I just think about the kind of utopian nature of everything that I'm saying, right? I mean, as someone who's been in the classroom and tried to get students to do this, this is a lofty ideal that I'm sort of throwing out there, that we can even, attempt to sort of pull this off. Kevin, the example I gave is, very rare example. One of the things, this book that I wrote, is in some ways picking up where Hatchell and Marsden's Search for Christian America left off, right? And I think what distinguishes the two books is, number one, I think mine is a sort of one-authored work that has a little bit more of a coherence than the individual essays that are in that book. But also, Noel Hatch and Marsden were engaging a sort of late 70s, early 80s, sort of Francis Schaeffer, Jerry Falwell. I'm more sort of engaging with the Bartons of the world and the more contemporary. But to get to your question, the reason I bring up that book, The Search for Christian America, is you know, some of these guys have devoted themselves deeply to trying to bring change in this area. And I wrestle with this myself. Nothing's changed. You know, the scholars have not really made a dent in this sort of Christian nationalist culture. Now, they've probably made a dent among an educated class of Christian college students who read this book in their American Revolution class or something like that, right? But they really haven't made a dent at all. And in fact, I would even argue since the appearance of these books, and this is nothing against those historians, I think since the appearance of those books, the Christian nationalist sentiment, for a variety of reasons, whether it be the Bush administration or whatever, has become stronger in some ways. So, you know, I mean, one of the things I tried to do with this book is to write it, you know, for a Christian audience. I've trying to publicize it in sort of circles. You know, I've done 25 radio interviews so far for the book. About 75% of them have been on conservative talk radio. I've gotten hammered. I mean, I've gotten, you know, sometimes it's been a little ugly, and I've just tried to keep civility, you know, where I'm not allowed to have a word in edgewise on this issue. You know, I mean, that's somebody who said, we were arguing the other day about Thomas Jefferson's religion. And I said, well, certainly Jefferson wasn't, this guy was saying Jefferson was born again. And I said, certainly Jefferson wasn't an Orthodox Christian. He rejected the inspiration of the Bible, the Trinity, even the resurrection. You know, well, he wasn't an Orthodox Christian, but he was a believer. You know, like, how do you argue with that? How do you, you know, debate that? And then, okay, and now, you know, let's go to the commercial break. You know, sort of thing. So in some ways, I'm sort of you know, caught up in these 2-minute sound bites that I'm sort of railing against. I don't know. I honestly don't know how it, you know, I mean, now a positive example. I taught a 5-week, I attended Evangelical Free Church in where I live in Mechanicsburg. I taught a 5-week class on this book. That was a wonderful experience. Most of the people there had read David Barton, and that's it. And in a face-to-face sort of community of people, there were about 45, 50 people who were in the class. It was a wonderful experience. Now, I don't know if I convinced everyone, but there was this, you know, you know, I just got done reading James Davison Hunter's book, To Change the World. And, you know, he talks about this idea of sort of faithful presence, you know, doing what you can in the places where God has placed you, whether that be West Shore Evangelical Free Church, you know, or the Mosiers know that church, right? Or you know, the local community center or the Rotary, you know, and is that going to make a dent? Who knows? But, you know, Hunter has some interesting things to say there about the way a culture gets changed. Now, so I wish I could give you some kind of definitive answer to that, but it's tough, you know, and in some ways you're like a donkey, feel like a Don Quixote all the time, sort of tilting at these windmills. But, you know, that's our vocation, right? You know, we just keep hammering, we just keep hammering ahead, keep going ahead. Yeah.
Oh, I think most, if not all, the people that approach history in this way that you're speaking of, that I've heard of, are historians, professors, people with doctorates. That kind of says to me that in order to get to that point, you have to study it and pursue it like crazy. Mm-hmm. And so, do you see a possibility for people, like I'm a history minor, on the side, major, so like people like me or people that aren't even majoring in history, do you see it possible for them to get this perspective on history without digging deeper than the standard textbook? If those,
I understand why I'm thinking about it. It's a good question. You know, how is the casual sort of history buff? You know, you're probably right. It's obviously going to take more reading than just the standard textbook. Having said that, you know, I'm optimistic on this. Again, maybe I'm a little too optimistic in this whole presentation. I'm very much aware of that. But I'm optimistic in the fact that, you know, there are, you know, look at the New York Times bestseller list. People do read history. You know, people are interested in reading David McCullough and, you know, Barbara Tuchman, I guess she's a little older now, or Ron Chernow on Washington or something to that effect. But they might be the people who might just be willing to change their minds based upon any kind, you know, they might be open to changing their minds. The people that read David Barton are not really, you know, they're looking to have their position confirmed, and they're not particularly interested in the complexity and so forth of the past. But maybe, and I could be, my problem here could be sort of just the failure of us being a sort of liberally educated society to begin with. That could be the issue. But it's amazing, though, to me. I mean, this is why I continue to do this. I mean, what's amazing to me is that there are Christians who are picking up David Barton by the millions in some cases and reading him, and or Marshall Emanuel, The Light and the Glory. I'm guessing if you go into the typical sort of evangelical household and they have one history book, it's either going to be something by David Barton or something by the late Peter Marshall and David Manuel, about providential history, and that's so. Could there be an alternative literature on that? But again, you need to be careful. I mean, I remember the first time I talked about this. And again, I'm deeply committed to sort of going into these local places and doing these things. I was in a retirement center. And I was young. I was, younger and dumber. And, I went in there like the academic, I'm going to show you that America wasn't a Christian nation, in a very conservative part of Pennsylvania where, and I went in both guns blazing, And it was awful. It was, for me, it was embarrassing. I look back, I'm embarrassed by that because I was trying to convince these people that everything they believed all their life was wrong, and I was ready to slam it down their throats. And, fortunately, they invite me back. I can't believe why. They invite me back twice a year to speak. But that's not the way to do it. There's got to be a sort of sensitivity and a grace associated with how to pull this off. And most academics aren't sort of in tune to, wired to do that. But, yeah, so. Yeah, David.
As historians, we see the danger of making moral judgments, and we try to shy away from them as much as possible, if for no other reason because morals are variable. Mm-hmm. However, in writing history, is it something that our readers expect? Do they expect us as historians to interpret history?
This is interesting. I was at a meeting of the Conference on Faith and History, I don't know, maybe it was 6 or 8 years ago, and there was this graduate student, I think she was from Canada, she might have been from like British Columbia or something, University of British Columbia, who was critiquing George Marsden's biography of Jonathan Edwards, and was very upset because it was such a detached, scholarly biography. And this woman was saying, hey, I'm a Christian. I wanted to learn. I wanted to grow spiritually from reading. I wanted Marsden to say yes, and Edwards was right. We should now. And actually, Marsden has done that in other sort of essays in non-academic places. But she was very disappointed at how his account of the Great Awakening. Right. This was God moving. I want to know this. I want Marsden to tell me this. So yeah, I think everybody's looking for that in history, and I just don't think that's the historian's primary task of doing. Now, it's hard not to. I'm not sitting here arguing for some type of objectivity or anything like that, but I would argue we try as hard as we can, knowing the limits, to sort of tell the truth, and this is sort of how we believe it happened. Someone else could be doing the same thing and come up with a completely different interpretation. I'm not suggesting that, But yeah, I mean, the past, it's two sides of the same coin. I mean, on one hand, I've stressed strangeness and foreignness and difference and so forth. But there is another side of that coin, right? The past does speak to the present. It does help us to understand the complexities of our world today. It should, in some ways, provide us with some kind of guidance in the present and so forth. But there the danger becomes just making the past little more than sort of a useful, what's good for us. And that's the danger when you go that direction. But certainly that's an important part of it. Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm just wondering, so with your take on how history is supposed to be practiced, are all other disciplines, when they approach history, only practicing a pseudo-history that
that seemed to be what I implied, didn't it? Yeah, I mean, I've said this and had colleagues at Messiah just, grill me on this, but I actually had an English major in a class where I mentioned this, and she was very upset that, literature, engaging with, and I would agree. But I do think, history is a separate discipline, I think, for a reason. We do sort of approach the past with the purpose of trying to understand what happened, good or bad, in all its sort of complexities. rather than using the past. You know, a sociologist might use the past, but the whole purpose, right, or point of a sociologist using the past, and forgive me for your sociology majors here, right, is to provide some necessary sort of background for the point that they want to make, you know, in the present, or how their study of human behavior affects the way we live today. Again, the study of history can do that, but I don't think that's the primary purpose. And I can't speak with any degree of authority to the way other disciplines do it, but there is something unique. Pick up Weinberg. It's a great, did you know Weinberg, Tracy, when you were, was he at UW with you, or never got to know him? Yeah, yeah. Are you familiar with the book? I mean, it's a great, I use it with my teachers. I teach a history, sort of teaching history course, and that's the sort of foundational text in that course.
So is there a final question?
Yeah.
With the as a result, but it seemed like you also talked about it as a method.
Yeah.
I just think, kind of back to Tiffany's question, like, I'm not sure how conceptually your advocacy of this transformative approach to history is conceptually different than maybe the conventionalist or the critique, the history is critique. I mean, how do you, like, ferret that out? If that's indeed what you meant, to be as a method and it's transformative things, not just kind of as.
Well, I think there's debate among historians about the role of empathy. I have a colleague in my own department who believes it's impossible to empathize in the past. You know, he'll give the example of, you know, you can't empathize with Hitler, or there's the danger of you'll buy into what he's saying, or, you know, something to that effect. I mean, Hayden White and others have, other sort of theorists have sort of made this same case that empathy is not. I tend to disagree. I mean, I think empathy and understanding is at the core of the discipline. I mean, you need to learn to listen to someone else, to walk in their shoes, if it means. I mean, I think that's the method that I'm referring to. Now, you could walk in the shoes of someone that you, as I said in the talk, that you might find morally reprehensible. I think history requires us to do that, and to at least understand, you know, what the world, you know, understand something about the world in which they lived, and understand something about, you know, how they engaged with that world. So, again, I'm not sure I'm answering your question or not, but I mean, I think it's a fundamental difference from sort of looking for the past simply for moral lessons, you know, to help us live better in the present. It's encountering the foreign country. You know, I'd like to think that empathy, you know, I'd like to think history, you know, I tell this to my students all the time, I'd like to think by studying history, you learn to understand people that are different from you. And this actually may be a transferable skill, if you want to use that phrase, that might actually help you get along better with the person in the cubicle next to you that you might not like in your first job, you know, because you learn these kinds of skills of how to empathize and how to listen.
All right. Thanks.
Thank you very much, everyone. I appreciate your attention.